Have you ever bought seed potatoes from the garden center, planted them carefully according to the instructions, and then ended up with a harvest so pathetic you wondered why you even bothered? You're not alone. Most home gardeners today get terrible results with potatoes, and they blame themselves. They assume they don't have a green thumb, or their soil isn't good enough, or they just don't know what they're doing. But the real problem isn't you. The problem is that the planting method you're following, the one that's printed on every seed packet and repeated in every modern gardening book, is fundamentally broken. Your grandmother knew this. She understood something about potato growing that's been systematically erased from modern advice, a simple rule based on measurements and ratios that optimized every plant for maximum yield. She could grow 3 times as many potatoes as you're getting right now from the same space without spending money on fertilizers or amendments. The knowledge wasn't complicated. And today, I'm going to show you exactly what that traditional rule was and why following it will change everything about your potato harvest. Let's start with what's actually happening in home gardens today, because the numbers tell a story that most people don't want to believe. According to data compiled by university extension services across the country, the average home gardener harvests between 1 and 2 pounds of potatoes per plant. 1 to 2 pounds. That's what most people are getting after months of care, regular watering, and waiting through the entire growing season. Now, before you start thinking that's just how potatoes work, let me give you some context. Commercial potato farms, using industrial equipment and heavy applications of synthetic fertilizers, average between 8 and 10 pounds per plant. They're using machinery, chemicals, and intensive management to hit those numbers. But here's what should really get your attention. Historical household gardens, the kind your grandparents and great-grandparents maintained during the Depression and through World War II, routinely produced 5 to 7 pounds of potatoes per plant. 5 to 7 pounds, using nothing but hand tools, basic compost, and traditional planting methods. Think about what that means. Your grandmother was getting triple the yield you're getting right now, not with better technology, not with expensive inputs, just with a different method. Let me break this down into practical terms so you can see what we're actually talking about. If you plant 10 potato plants in your backyard, which is a pretty standard small garden setup, modern planting methods will give you somewhere between 15 and 20 pounds of potatoes total. Maybe enough for a dozen meals if you're stretching it. That's barely worth the space and effort. But those same 10 plants, planted using the traditional method your grandmother would have followed, would yield 50 to 70 pounds. That's not a small difference. That's the gap between a side dish and a legitimate food staple. That's the difference between we grew some potatoes and we don't need to buy potatoes for half the year. According to research comparing modern home gardening results to historical agricultural data from the 1940s and 50s, today's home gardeners are producing roughly 1/3 the yield per square foot that previous generations achieved. 1/3. We're getting a fraction of what our grandparents got from the same amount of space with the same amount of work. So what's going wrong? Most modern gardeners assume the problem is something they're doing wrong personally. They think their soil isn't good enough, or they didn't water correctly, or they just don't have the natural talent for growing things. But the truth is both simpler and more frustrating than that. The problem isn't the gardener. The problem is the method itself. The standard advice you'll find in every modern gardening book, on every seed packet, and in every online tutorial has been simplified down to almost nothing. Plant your seed potatoes 4 inches deep. Space them about 12 inches apart. Water them regularly. Cross your fingers and hope for the best. That's basically it. No discussion of seed potato sizing. No attention to the relationship between depth and spacing, no understanding of what the plant actually needs to maximize production. And the really frustrating part? It wasn't always like this. Your grandmother wasn't guessing when she planted potatoes. She wasn't relying on luck or hoping for good weather. She was following a specific, systematic method that had been passed down through generations, refined over decades, and proven to work consistently year after year. According to agricultural extension bulletins and gardening guides published in the 1940s and 50s, there was a clear, well-documented approach to planting potatoes that showed up across different regions and different cultural traditions. This wasn't some obscure secret. It was common knowledge, the kind of thing you'd learn from your parents when you were 10 years old, or pick up in a 4-H club, or find explained in any basic county extension pamphlet. The traditional method centered on understanding the relationship between three things: the size of your seed potato, the depth you planted it, and the spacing between plants. These weren't arbitrary numbers someone made up. They were measurements that accounted for how potato plants actually grow, how their underground stems develop, and what they need to produce maximum yields. This approach appeared consistently in USDA publications, state agricultural bulletins, and victory garden guides during World War II. It was taught systematically in farm communities because it worked systematically. During the Depression, when families absolutely had to maximize every square foot of garden space to survive, this was the method that delivered results. People couldn't afford to waste space or seed potatoes on experimental approaches. They needed methods that worked every single time. Then something started to change. Beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through the 80s and 90s, this detailed, ratio-based approach began disappearing from gardening advice. The newer guides, the mass market books, the commercial seed packets, they all replaced the traditional method with simplified, universal instructions. Plant 4 inches deep regardless of seed size. Space 12 inches apart regardless of variety. Don't worry about the details, just follow these basic steps. The traditional knowledge got dismissed as too complicated for modern gardeners, or too old-fashioned for contemporary methods, or unnecessary now that we had improved seed varieties. County extension services, which had been providing detailed, region-specific advice for free since the early 1900s, saw their budgets slashed in the 1980s. The comprehensive bulletins they used to publish became harder to find. The local agents who used to teach these methods at community meetings stopped getting funded. And in the span of just one generation, maybe 2 at most, the knowledge simply vanished from common circulation. Not because it stopped working, not because someone discovered it was wrong. It just quietly disappeared from the conversation while everyone assumed someone else was preserving it. Your grandmother didn't write it down in a family journal because why would she? Everyone knew it. It was as basic as knowing when to plant after the last frost, or how deep to plant corn. You didn't document obvious things. But when that assumption of shared knowledge broke, when the oral transmission chain got interrupted by commercial publishing and simplified advice, the traditional method was gone before most people even realized it was endangered. All right, let me break down exactly what the traditional rule actually said, because once you understand it, you're going to wonder why anyone ever thought simplifying it was a good idea. Here's what your grandmother knew. Every seed potato you planted had to be evaluated individually based on its size, and that size determined both how deep you planted it and how you spaced it from its neighbors. The rule was straightforward. Take your seed potato, which should be roughly the size of a chicken egg, or slightly larger, about 2 to 3 ounces with at least one strong, visible eye. The depth you plant, it needs to be approximately 3 times the height of that seed potato itself. So if you're holding a seed potato that's about 1.5 inches tall when you set it on the ground, you'd plant it 4 to 5 inches deep. Not 4 inches because a book said so, but 4 to 5 inches because that's 3 times the height of that specific seed potato. Now, here's the part that made the biggest difference in actual yields. The spacing between plants within a row needed to be 12 to 15 inches minimum, not 8 inches like many modern guides suggest, not 10 inches like you'll see on commercial seed packets. 12 to 15 inches, measured carefully. And between rows, you needed 30 to 36 inches of space. Let me explain why these specific measurements mattered so much. Because this wasn't arbitrary tradition. It was based on understanding how potato plants actually function biologically. The depth ratio, that 3-to-1 rule, accounted for the stored energy in the seed potato versus the distance the sprout needed to travel before it could start photosynthesizing and feeding itself. Think about it this way. A seed potato is essentially a battery of stored carbohydrates. The sprout has to use that energy to push up through the soil and reach sunlight before the battery runs out. If you plant a small seed potato too deep, it exhausts its energy reserves before breaking the surface, and the plant either dies or emerges so weak it never recovers. If you plant a large seed potato too shallow, you're not giving the plant's underground stems, the stolons, enough vertical room below the seed to develop properly and produce tubers. The spacing rule worked on similar biological logic. Potato plants don't just grow upward. The majority of their growth happens underground, horizontally. Those stolons, the stems that actually produce the tubers you harvest, spread out in all directions from the base of the plant. They typically extend 8 to 12 inches in every direction when the plant is healthy and has adequate space. When you crowd potatoes together at 8 or 10 inches, like modern advice often recommends, those stolon zones overlap. The plants end up competing with each other for the same underground real estate, the same soil nutrients, the same moisture. Each plant is literally fighting its neighbors for space to produce tubers. Your grandmother understood this, either because her parents explained it to her or because she'd seen the results enough times to recognize the pattern. Give each plant adequate space, and it can produce 8 to 12 individual tubers of good size. Crowd them together, and you might get 6 or 8 tubers, but they'll be smaller, and the total weight per plant drops dramatically. The traditional spacing gave each plant room to reach its full biological potential without interference. That's why it worked. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, okay, that sounds reasonable, but was this really science or just folk wisdom that happened to work sometimes? And that's a fair question. So let me show you what modern agricultural research has discovered when they actually bothered to test these traditional methods. According to studies from multiple land-grant universities over the past 20 years, including research programs at the University of Idaho, Michigan State University, and Cornell, the optimal planting depth for potatoes absolutely does vary based on seed piece size. The research confirms that the 3-to-1 depth ratio your grandmother used maximizes both emergence rates and stolon development zones. They tested it. They measured it. And the traditional rule was right. Here's what the university trials found. When researchers planted seed potatoes of different sizes at various depths and tracked the results, the plants that followed approximately the 3-to-1 ratio showed significantly higher emergence percentages and developed more robust underground stem systems. The science validated what generations of gardeners already knew from experience. The spacing research is even more conclusive. Multiple university trials have documented that 12 to 15-inch in-row spacing produces substantially higher yields per plant in home garden conditions compared to tighter spacing. One particular study from the University of Wisconsin Extension tested potato plants at different spacing intervals and found that plants spaced at 12 inches produced an average of 6.2 pounds per plant, while plants spaced at 8 inches, which is what a lot of modern seed packets recommend, produced only 3.8 pounds per plant, 6.2 versus 3.8. That's a 63% increase in yield from spacing alone. Not from fertilizer, not from better varieties, just from giving the plants adequate room. The biological mechanisms are well understood now. Potato plants produce tubers on those underground stems, stolons, that radiate out from the main stem base. Research using root imaging technology has shown that these stolons typically extend 8 to 12 inches horizontally in all directions when the plant has adequate nutrients and space. When you plant potatoes only 8 inches apart, the stolon development zones overlap by 30 to 40%. The plants are competing for the same underground territory. Think about it like this. If you planted 2 tomato plants so close together that their branches were constantly tangled and fighting for the same sunlight, you wouldn't expect either plant to produce well. The same principle applies underground with potatoes, except we can't see the competition happening. We just see smaller yields at harvest and assume that's normal. Commercial potato operations can sometimes get away with tighter spacing, but only because they compensate with massive applications of synthetic fertilizers and precision irrigation systems. They're essentially force-feeding the plants enough nutrients to overcome the competition. In a typical home garden setting, where most people aren't applying intensive fertilizer programs, that approach fails. The traditional method optimized for biological potential without requiring purchased inputs. Each plant got the space it needed to develop a complete network of stolons and produce 8 to 12 tubers of substantial size. No competition. No need for excessive amendments. Just proper spacing combined with the plant's natural biology doing what millions of years of evolution designed it to do. So, if the traditional method works demonstrably better for home gardeners, and modern research has confirmed the biology behind it, why did it disappear from all the advice we're given today? Here's where the story gets interesting, and honestly, more than a little frustrating. Before the 1970s, the majority of gardening advice that reached home gardeners came from agricultural extension services, experienced regional experts, and long-time growers who'd been producing food for decades. These were people whose credibility and reputations depended entirely on giving advice that actually delivered results. County extension agents weren't trying to sell you products. They were government employees whose job was to help people succeed at growing food. If their advice failed, they heard about it directly from the community members they served. But starting in the mid-70s and accelerating rapidly through the 80s and 90s, the gardening publishing world went through a fundamental transformation. Commercial publishers consolidated the market. Large seed companies and fertilizer manufacturers started partnering with garden writers and producing their own educational materials. The advice that reached home gardeners increasingly came from sources that had direct financial incentives tied to what you purchased. And here's the thing about the traditional potato planting rule. It didn't require you to buy much of anything. You needed seed potatoes, which you were going to purchase anyway. And that was essentially it. No pre-plant fertilizer, no mid-season feeding program, no special soil amendments or treatments. The method worked by optimizing the plant's natural biological processes. You gave it proper spacing and depth, and the plant did what it evolved to do. But from a commercial standpoint, that creates a problem. If gardeners can succeed with minimal purchased inputs, they're not particularly profitable customers. So the advice gradually shifted, subtly but deliberately, toward methods that assumed you'd be buying products. Modern potato planting instructions almost always include recommendations for starter fertilizer at planting time, additional feeding during the growing season, and various treatments for issues that proper spacing would largely prevent. The traditional ratio-based rules got characterized as, quote, 2 for average gardeners. But let's be completely honest about what that framing really meant. These rules weren't actually complicated. A 10-year-old child in 1945 could learn them in 5 minutes and apply them successfully. They were called, quote, three because they were too simple, too effective, without requiring product purchases. They didn't create opportunities for ongoing sales. The advice also got universalized in ways that ignored both regional differences and scale differences. Commercial farming methods, which are designed for mechanical harvesting equipment and chemical-intensive production systems, got watered down into generic, simple instructions that didn't work particularly well for anyone, but looked good printed on a seed packet. Meanwhile, extension services that had provided free, regionally specific, scientifically sound advice for generations saw their budgets systematically cut, starting in the Reagan administration. The detailed bulletins they used to publish became harder and harder to find. The local expertise that used to be available at community meetings and through phone consultations largely disappeared. And in the process of all this economic and institutional change, the actual knowledge that had sustained home food production for generations just quietly vanished from mainstream gardening advice. Not because anyone proved it wrong, not because better methods were discovered. It disappeared because it worked too well without creating profit opportunities for the companies that increasingly controlled the information flow. And this pattern, this replacement of proven traditional methods with commercial advice that requires purchased inputs, it's not limited to potatoes. The same thing happened across nearly every aspect of home food production over the past 50 years. Traditional companion planting systems, the ones that had been refined over generations and actually increased yields, got reduced to vague suggestions like plant marigolds near your tomatoes. No specific ratios, no discussion of proper spacing, no explanation of the mechanisms that made it work. Just a cute idea that might help a little if you're lucky. The Three Sisters method, where corn, beans, and squash were planted in precise ratios that maximized total production from a given space, got turned into a novelty garden project instead of being taught as a serious food production technique. Seed-saving practices that allowed families to grow food year after year from their own seeds got replaced by advice to, quote, six. Never mind that your grandparents saved seeds successfully for decades and got excellent, consistent harvests. Seed companies needed you coming back every single spring. Regional planting calendars, those careful calculations based on local last frost dates and soil temperature patterns that varied significantly by location, got replaced by generic national planting guides that sort of work okay, sometimes if conditions happen to be typical. Traditional timing methods, including planting by moon phases, which actually corresponded with documented soil moisture and germination patterns, got dismissed wholesale as superstition. No testing required, labeled as old wives' tales, and removed from respectable gardening advice, despite generations of farmers having careful records showing effectiveness. Soil-building techniques with specific compost ratios and crop rotation patterns got replaced by apply fertilizer X at the rate shown on the package. Never mind that your grandmother's compost system and basic understanding of nitrogen-fixing cover crops produced healthier soil and better vegetables without spending money every season. Every single one of these knowledge losses followed the exact same pattern. Traditional method equals free or very cheap. Commercial replacement equals regular purchases. And the cumulative effect is staggering when you actually look at the data. According to research comparing historical garden productivity records with modern home garden surveys, the average home garden today produces approximately 40 to 60% less food per square foot than equivalent-sized gardens maintained during the Depression era. 40 to 60% less. We're using more space, spending significantly more money on supplies, amendments, and tools, and getting dramatically worse results than our grandparents achieved with basic hand tools and accumulated knowledge. Here's what makes this even more painful. When you adjust for inflation, modern home gardeners spend more annually on seeds, fertilizers, pest controls, and amendments than Depression-era families spent on their entire gardening operation. We are literally paying more money to fail harder at something our grandparents did successfully on smaller budgets. And the vast majority of current gardeners have absolutely no idea what's been lost because we never learned what was actually possible. When your potato plants produce 1 pound each, you assume that's just how potato growing works because everyone else you know is getting similar results. You don't realize that your grandmother routinely harvested 6 or 7 pounds from each plant in the same space with the same amount of work. The knowledge didn't just fade away through natural generational drift, the way languages or cultural practices sometimes do. It was actively displaced, systematically replaced by commercial advice specifically designed to create dependency on purchased products, rather than teaching genuine self-sufficiency and competence. But here's the good news, and this is really why I wanted to walk through all of this history and science with you. Once you actually know what the traditional rule was, it's not difficult to follow. And when you apply it this spring, the difference in your results will be obvious and immediate. Let me give you the exact step-by-step process for using the traditional potato planting method in your own garden. First, select your seed potatoes carefully. You want pieces that are approximately egg-sized, about 2 to 3 ounces each, with at least one strong, clearly visible eye. If you're cutting larger potatoes into seed pieces, make sure each piece meets that size guideline and has a good eye. Then let them cure at room temperature for 24 to 48 hours, so the cut surfaces can form a protective corky layer that prevents rot. Second, calculate your planting depth for each seed potato. Measure the height of the seed potato when you set it on a flat surface. Multiply that measurement by 3. That's your planting depth. For most standard seed potatoes, this works out to about 4 to 5 inches, but you're making the decision based on the actual seed piece, not just following a universal number from a packet. Third, mark out your spacing carefully before you start planting. Within each row, space your seed potatoes 12 to 15 inches apart. Actually measure this, don't estimate. Between rows, leave 30 to 36 inches of space. I know this feels like a lot of room if you're used to modern cramped planting advice, but trust the biological logic here. Each plant needs adequate space for underground development. Fourth, timing matters. Plant your potatoes in spring when your soil temperature reaches 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit consistently. You can check this with an inexpensive soil thermometer, or you can use the traditional indicator method and wait until dandelions in your area start blooming, which generally corresponds with soil hitting that temperature range. Your grandmother didn't have a soil thermometer, but she knew the natural indicators that signaled the right conditions. Fifth, as your plants grow and the stems reach about 6 inches in height, hill soil up around the base of each plant. This means mounding soil from between the rows up around the stems, creating a small hill. This technique encourages the plant to form additional stolons higher up on the buried stem and protects developing tubers near the surface from sunlight exposure, which turns them green and makes them bitter and mildly toxic. That's the complete method. No complicated feeding schedule, no special soil amendments, no purchased disease treatments, just proper seed selection, calculated depth based on seed size, adequate spacing, appropriate timing, and basic hilling. Follow these traditional guidelines, and you should realistically expect 5 to 7 pounds of potatoes per plant instead of the 1 to 2 pounds that modern methods typically produce. Think about what that means in practical terms. 10 plants following the traditional rule gives you 50 to 70 pounds of storage quality potatoes. That's not a garnish for a few meals. That's actual food security. That's the difference between supplemental gardening and genuinely reducing your grocery bills. and increasing your household food independence. And here's what I think matters most about everything we've discussed. This isn't really just a story about growing potatoes more successfully. Think about what it actually means that this systematic, proven knowledge almost completely disappeared in the span of just 50 years. In 2 generations, in the time between your grandmother's childhood and your own, practical wisdom that had sustained families through economic depressions, world wars, and genuine food scarcity nearly went extinct. Your grandmother didn't write down the potato planting rule in a journal or a family recipe book because the idea wouldn't have occurred to her. Everyone just knew it. It was common knowledge passed naturally from parent to child, taught casually while working in the garden together. Why would you document something that obvious? But when that oral transmission chain broke, when commercial advice replaced community knowledge and extension services lost their funding and traditional methods got dismissed as old-fashioned, the accumulated wisdom of generations vanished faster than anyone anticipated or noticed. And here's the question that should concern all of us. What else are we losing right now without even realizing it? How many other traditional techniques, proven and refined over decades or centuries, are sitting exclusively in the memories of elderly gardeners and farmers who simply assume someone else must be preserving and teaching these things? How much practical, tested knowledge dies every single year just because we stopped asking our elders the right questions and started trusting that everything important would be available in a book or online? But knowledge can be recovered, and you've just proven that to yourself. You learned a rule that's more than 100 years old in less than 15 minutes. When you follow this method next spring and dig up 6 pounds of potatoes from a plant that used to give you barely 1 pound, you're not just growing more food. You're actively reclaiming something real and valuable that was almost lost. You're proving that the old ways aren't inferior just because they're old, and that sometimes traditional methods were traditional precisely because they actually worked better than what replaced them. And more importantly than just growing better potatoes yourself, you can pass this knowledge forward. Teach your kids why spacing matters and show them how to calculate planting depth based on seed size. Share it with neighbors who are frustrated with their disappointing harvests. Write it down in a place where it won't depend solely on human memory and oral tradition. The knowledge almost disappeared once. Don't let it happen again just because you assumed someone else was taking care of preservation. Modern advice, commercial advice, isn't automatically better just because it's newer or because it comes printed on glossy seed packets from major companies. Sometimes, honestly, more often than we like to admit, the old way was old simply because it worked consistently, and it only disappeared because it didn't create enough profit opportunities for corporations that wanted to sell you products every season. Your grandmother was right about considerably more than just potatoes. She understood something that our culture has largely forgotten. Real food security, genuine self-sufficiency, comes from knowledge and skill, not from dependence on purchased inputs and commercial systems. She knew that methods which had been proven over multiple generations were worth preserving, worth teaching carefully to the next generation, worth defending against the pressure to simplify and commercialize everything. The choice, as it always is yours. You can keep following the simplified commercial advice that's designed primarily to sell products rather than to help you succeed. Or you can reclaim these traditional methods that actually fed families for generations. Plant your potatoes the way your grandmother planted hers and see the difference for yourself. Compare your harvest this year to previous years. Count the pounds. Feel the weight of real food production. And maybe, just maybe, 20 or 30 years from now, your own grandchildren will remember that you were the one who knew how to grow a genuine potato harvest, because you took the time to learn what had almost been forgotten, because you valued proven wisdom over convenient marketing, because you understood that the best way to honor the knowledge of previous generations is to use it, to teach it, and to refuse to let it disappear.